Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you to Naropa's Nalanda Event Center. Welcome those of you that are online participating in this quite monumental event. This Shared Sacred Stories initiative, which was imagined and funded by the Fetzer Institute, we'll hear much more about that. I also want to welcome the Naropa students who are participating in the World Wisdom Intensive Weekend. Is that right? Got it right? Close enough. Immersive Weekend, okay. My name is Chuck Leaf. Tomorrow, Naropa will have the great joy of inaugurating Dr. Paul Burkhart to serve as our 8th president. I'm delighted to have been asked as the old guy to welcome you here this evening. There is seemingly no retirement from this job, but I'm happy to be here. Fetzer Institute invited leaders of the great world faith traditions to come together and to start by retelling their own stories, reignite the sacred flames that have long energized these traditions, and to explore the rich ways in which these stories can be interwoven to frame a sacred society. At a time when considering the sacred might be seen as quaint and non-productive, the immense work of the scholar practitioners who led this project is a great gift. And for those of you that are about to experience the book, I think you'll understand what I'm saying as you kind of go through it. Thanks to the generosity and vision of John Fetzer, the Fetzer Institute has for more than 60 years supported the work of spiritual communities, teachers, scientists, and thought leaders whose work is based on sacred love, who envision sacred flourishing and have defined the mind and heart opening into a sacred mystery. Far from esoteric, this work, arising from the deep compassion and curiosity of a business leader from the Midwest, the owner of the Detroit Tigers, imagines an interconnected and compassionate world serving a universe of sentient beings. Naropa has been a partner with Fetzer over the years in many initiatives, and we are honored that we are hosting the first of the Sacred Stories events to take place around the world. On the stage are, my script is different. On the stage are 5. Bill was going to be welcomed up, but now you're here, so this is good. Panelists, each of whom have had a role in the creation of the stories. Dr. Rory McEntee, what's the order? Yes, there it is the co-president and executive director of the Acharya Foundation for New Monasticism and Interspirituality. He is also the co-leader of the Interspiritual team, which I'm sure you'll hear more about. Dr. Ananatanand Rambachan is the Emeritus Professor of Religion at St. Olaf College, Northfield, Minnesota. He was the leader of the Hinduism team and member of the core Shared Sacred Stories team. Naropa is also honored that Dr. Rambachan served as our World Wisdom Lecturer here this week, and so students have had an opportunity already to experience his wisdom and wit. Dr. Judith Zimmer-Brown is an Emerita Professor of Contemplative and Religious Studies at Naropa University. She's the co-leader of the Buddhism team, co-leader of the Shared Sacred Story team. Judith and I have been colleagues for a half a century, and there's no conversation about contemplative education which doesn't find its roots in her teaching, her scholarship, and her practice. Pierre Netanel Miles-Yepez, together with Rory, is the co-president of the Acharya Foundation for New Monasticism and Interspirituality. He's also the chair of the Wisdom Traditions Department at Naropa and co-leader of the Interspiritual team. We're also very pleased tonight to be joined by Dr. Bill Vendley. Bill is the Vice President for World Religions and Spirituality at the Fetzer Institute. He was formerly Secretary General of Religions for Peace International. Dr. Vendley led its World Council of 60 senior religious leaders from all continents. He's a pioneer in advancing multi-religious cooperation to help resolve conflict and advance development, and has facilitated the establishment of multi-religious councils around the world. In Religions for Peace, he started with religious communities in more than 90 countries to mount concrete projects in conflict resolution, protecting human dignity, and advancing integral human development that honors the full person while protecting the earth. He's been awarded numerous prizes for religion and human rights and serves on the board of a number of organizations, ranging from the fine arts to those committed to peace building. At Fetzer Institute, Dr. Vendley was also the designer and leader of the entire Shared Sacred Stories project. The teams that were brought together were also supported by teams of scientists, social scientists, who affirmed the complementarity of scientific and spiritual modes of inquiry. The shared sacred story teams also have created an inclusive story of humanity's experience of the sacred. These teams and their international advisors from every continent constitute hundreds of scholar practitioners, spiritual leaders, and scientists, and Bill has skillfully led these diverse teams through 4 years of collaborative work that produced the book Retelling Sacred Stories, which was just published by Orbis Press and is available this evening. So please join me in welcoming our presenters to Naropa University.
Chuck, thank you very much for all you've done all these years, but also for your extraordinarily generous introduction of all of us. So we're deeply honored to be here, and note the timing of your welcoming us and your own life. So thank you very much. So I want to give us a little bit of an introduction before the panel, which is the real main event, unfolds. And we're talking about story. So let's just take a simple moment to recognize that everyone who walked into this room and everybody on Zoom is in the middle of their own story. That middle points back, so to speak, to an origin. It's quite mysterious origin. I'm not talking about your address of the house where you were first born. And it points forward, and that too is extremely mysterious. But from our very beginning as a human family, we awoke to the fact that we were in the middle of a story. And you have that story, I have a story, and the point that I think is not often grasped, but we need, or it's helpful to grasp, is there's a seed worldview in your story. Your story is open to a world. Now, you're not pinned into that story because you've noticed that your story changes. So on the one hand, you inhabit a story. In that sense, you're always in it, you're story bound. But on the other hand, you somehow stand outside of it. And even when you tell it to your deepest friend, you're both in it and out of it at the same time. So that's a clue for us as a team. Secondly, the point that I want to make is that we are all in stories and stories of stories and stories. We have multiple stories that we're abiding in. And so you have your family story, and you have your clan's story, or the country you came from story, or your religion's story. But we today have a shared story. We're already living in a shared story, but it's not a terribly nice story. It's the story of modernity, and I'm not scorning the beauties that modernity has brought us, but it's a story that models reality as material. And in that sense, for people here, I'm sure, in this room, it's a reductive story. It claims it's based in science, but a more careful attention to science discloses that interpretation of science is not scientific. But nevertheless, that's the world that is the world of the United Nations. It's the world of most of our premier universities, not Naropa. I'm very charmed to be able to be with you and gratefully acknowledge that. But it is the dominant story. It's the story that's in our presses. It's the story that is so omnipresent that if you're not in a group like Naropa, you can actually feel alienated because you need to relate and you sort of put to the side your own deep sacred orientation if you have one. Let me illustrate it real quickly. Have you heard of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals? Does it ring a distant bell, if not a loud bell? These are the goals not for developing nations and not for middle nations or wealthy nations. These are the goals for all of the nations. Goals that take us to 2030. We're way behind on these goals, by the way. But these are the goals for sustainable development. Sounds terrific. And I know many of the people who are the brightest lights who have been putting that work together. I admire them tremendously. But you could read all of those goals, and you would never once encounter the word sacred. You would never once encounter the word heart. You wouldn't encounter the word compassion, love, forgiveness, truth, fortitude, courage. The very things we know that we build our lives out of, and when we build them deeply, we turn into the very sources of those capacities and those strengths. So the project of telling a shared sacred story and the process of getting there has for us an exquisite, winsome, poetic beauty to it. But it also has an earthly, I want to say urgent issue of human survival and planetary survival, that we get our story right. That it's a story that we can all truly live with, a story that would allow us to be who we understand ourselves most deeply, most intimately to be, in our radical relatedness to each other, to our co-building of societies that would sustain us, that would help us to be the persons we're to be, we feel called to be, and would honor this miraculous earth and its pulsing web of life that too is grounded in what we experience as the sacred. So the stakes are high. This was not simply an enterprise of earnest, deeply contemplative scholars overjoyed to meet each other. This was a calling that unless we find a story for our human family that is true, deeply true, and grounded in the very depths that we know ourselves to be grounded in a depth so deep we can't get to the bottom of it, and so true of our beautiful earth and a web of life, we will model ourselves like the dominant reductive view, and that model is a machine. Much brilliance occurred in the last 400 years of what we call modern science. But at its onset, an early sign of divorce began to take place. And in divorces, unfortunate things happen. People divide the spoils, and they become, in a certain way, more rigid in terms of, not always happily, they're happy divorces, I realize that, but I'm making a caricature here. But you can then move easily to a science that understands itself as antithetical, no space possible. The only real is what we can measure, the correlation of ranges of data. Well, Judith would tell us that the unconditioned luminous awareness is not a data point. Anant would tell us the very same thing. And the other Christian traditions would make the same point as well. So to try to steer our boat, our collective human project, by reducing ourselves to simply the correlation of ranges of data, when perhaps the sacred isn't a datum, isn't confined to a place and time, a particular point. So we were committed to find a way to tell a shared sacred story, because in our deepest hearts we believe that all of the sacred stories at their depths are shared stories. Buddhism has its story, Hinduism has its story, Islam has its story. We can go on. We dealt with 8 traditions and an interspiritual. But they weren't talking about a particular space of reality. Each of those stories are trying to talk about reality as a whole, but as the Buddhists can experience it, as the Hindus can experience it, as Muslims can experience, as the Christians can experience it, the Confucians can experience it. So we set ourselves a job, and I had the joy of picking the teams, but I consulted among the people I knew in the teams to help me then further pick. And here's what we wanted. We wanted people with profound roots in their traditions. We wanted them to be scholars of their tradition, but scholars in the most original sense of being a religious scholar, seeking to understand in a halting way that unnameable experience of the sacred that simply cannot be captured fully in the ordinary sentences that we use with nouns and verbs and objects and so forth. So it was a special requirement. And people who were citizens of this time, our age, fully contemporary people, alert to our promises and the grievous perils we all face. And people who had also had deep experience across religious traditions. So we were picking very special people who were contemplatives in their own traditions, who were willing to dive deep into their part of the Pacific Ocean and swim and swim and swim as their life's joy. And so how would we do this? Well, first of all, we were convinced, and I mentioned this, that the original shared sacred stories are what we call other world religions. They're really trying to talk about the fullness of reality. So we asked our teams to take on a retelling of their sacred story. So Anant was asked to retell a Hindu story, faithfully, but creatively. Tradition is yesterday's creativity. It's our memory. Tradition-ing is the step forward, and to retell would be radically faithful to its origin and to the way it iterated itself over time, but now faces new challenges. And what was the mandate? Judith, Anant, Netanel, Rory, and all the others, retell your sacred stories to illustrate or to give the experience of how your taste of the sacred in your heritage grounds you in solidarity or interbeing with the rest of the human family and all of the rest of the community of being, for us, the earth and its web of life. There's a very authentic way to ask each of the traditions to retell to the rest of the world what the experience of the sacred does in terms of grounding them in a radical solidarity of unrestricted mercy, compassion, or love, and the earth that we share. So that was the assignment. They had a particular request to retell their stories in our time, in our period, with our challenges, our promises, faithfully but creatively. Well, great. That's a good start. And those stand as their own stories. Each one is a jewel. Each one asks the reader to open their heart to contain the experience of the mercy or the love or the compassion that they experience dramatically by reading the story. Can you find space within yourself for this extraordinary experience of the sacred? But as we know, that's just a beginning. So we felt that was a preliminary end in itself, but preliminary to telling a shared sacred story. Parallel, we brought scientists, really good scientists, really reflective scientists, reflective about what they're doing when they do science. That's my 15 minutes. So I'm going to round it out, and then I'll turn it over. I'm almost there. So two or 3 minutes, and we'll get into the real stuff here. And they had a mandate. Radically faithful to science as science, the most sophisticated and earnest science, to examine what the praxis of science is, the engagement of the consciousness of the scientist, and to bring that into a correlation with the spiritual mode of inquiry. So could we find bridges, a resonance between the scientific mode of inquiry and what I'll call the spiritual mode of inquiry? Well, it won't shock you. These were people who were already seized, like we were, that resonance is profound. That those quests both set out for they want to plumb the depths all the way. Scientists aren't happy, say, oh, I think we know a little more, that's enough. There's a quest there. And so that group gave us another extraordinary prerequisite for trying to tell a shared sacred story. With those as prerequisites, I need to take 1 or 2 more minutes and I'm done. And I want to tell you about the secret sauce. And this is really what really allows this to happen. So have you ever held a baby that's pre-verbal and looked into the baby's eyes and cooed to the baby, and what did you get? You got a radiant smile of mutual recognition. Pre-verbal knowing that I'm known, knowing that I'm loved, or that I'm being held in compassion. We had to retrace that step. We couldn't use the Buddhist language for the shared sacred story, or the Hindu language for the shared sacred story, or indigenous language for the shared sacred story. We had to go back to that most primordial interbeing, or primordial transcendent mutuality for your story bound. But on the other hand, you somehow stand outside of it. And even when you tell it to your deepest friend, you're both in it and out of it at the same time. So that's a clue for us as a team. Secondly, the point that I want to make is that we are all in stories and stories of stories and stories. We have multiple stories that we're abiding in. And so you have your family story, and you have your clan's story, or the country you came from story, or your religion's story. But we today have a shared story. We're already living in a shared story, but it's not a terribly nice story. It's the story of modernity, and I'm not scorning the beauties that modernity has brought us. But it's a story that models reality as material. And in that sense, for people here, I'm sure, in this room, it's a reductive story. It claims it's based in science, but a more careful attention to science discloses that that interpretation of science is not scientific. But nevertheless, that's the world that is the world of the United Nations. It's the world of most of our premier universities, not Naropa. I'm very charmed to be able to be with you and gratefully acknowledge that. But it is the dominant story. It's the story that's in our presses. It's the story that is so omnipresent that if you're not in a group like Naropa, you can actually feel alienated because you need to relate, and you sort of put to the side your own deep sacred orientation if you have one. Let me illustrate it real quickly. Have you heard of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals? Does it ring a distant bell, if not a loud bell? These are the goals not for developing nations and not for middle nations or wealthy nations. These are the goals for all of the nations. Goals that take us to 2030. We're way behind on these goals, by the way. But these are the goals for sustainable development. Sounds terrific. And I know many of the people who are the brightest lights who have been putting that work together. I admire them tremendously. But you could read all of those goals, and you would never once encounter the word sacred. You would never once encounter the word heart. You wouldn't encounter the word compassion, love, forgiveness, truth, fortitude, courage. The very things we know that we build our lives out of, and when we build them deeply, we turn into the very sources of those capacities and those strengths. So the project of telling a shared sacred story and the process of getting there has for us an exquisite, winsome, poetic beauty to it. But it also has an earthly, I want to say urgent issue of human survival and planetary survival, that we get our story right. That it's a story that we can all truly live with, a story that would allow us to be who we understand ourselves most deeply, most intimately to be, in our radical relatedness to each other, to our co-building of societies that would sustain us, that would help us to be the persons we're to be, we feel called to be, and would honor this miraculous earth and its pulsing web of life that too is grounded in what we experience as the sacred. So the stakes are high. This was not simply an enterprise of earnest, deeply contemplative scholars overjoyed to meet each other. This was a calling that unless we find a story for our human family that is true, deeply true, and grounded in the very depths that we know ourselves to be grounded in a depth so deep we can't get to the bottom of it, and so true of our beautiful earth and a web of life, we will model ourselves like the dominant reductive view, and that model is a machine. Much brilliance occurred in the last 400 years of what we call modern science. But at its onset, an early sign of divorce began to take place. And in divorces, unfortunate things happen. People divide the spoils, and they become, in a certain way, more rigid in terms of, not always happily, they're happy divorces, I realize that, but I'm making a caricature here. But you can then move easily to a science that understands itself as antithetical, no space possible. The only real is what we can measure, the correlation of ranges of data. Well, Judith would tell us that the unconditioned luminous awareness is not a data point. Anant would tell us the very same thing. And the other Christian traditions would make the same point as well. So to try to steer our boat, our collective human project, by reducing ourselves to simply the correlation of ranges of data, when perhaps the sacred isn't a datum, isn't confined to a place and time, a particular point. So we were committed to find a way to tell a shared sacred story, because in our deepest hearts we believe that all of the sacred stories at their depths are shared stories. Buddhism has its story, Hinduism has its story, Islam has its story. We can go on. We dealt with 8 traditions and an interspiritual. But they weren't talking about a particular space of reality. Each of those stories are trying to talk about reality as a whole, but as the Buddhists can experience it, as the Hindus can experience it, as Muslims can experience, as the Christians can experience it, the Confucians can experience it. So we set ourselves a job. And I had the joy of picking the teams, but I consulted among the people I knew in the teams to help me then further pick. And here's what we wanted. We wanted people with profound roots in their traditions. We wanted them to be scholars of their tradition, but scholars in the most original sense of being a religious scholar, seeking to understand in a halting way that unnameable experience of the sacred that simply cannot be captured fully in the ordinary sentences that we use with nouns and verbs and objects and so forth. So it was a special requirement. And people who were citizens of this time, our age, fully contemporary people, alert to our promises and the grievous perils we all face. And people who had also had deep experience across religious traditions. So we were picking very special people who were contemplatives in their own traditions, who were willing to dive deep into their part of the Pacific Ocean and swim and swim and swim as their life's joy. And so how would we do this? Well, first of all, we were convinced, and I mentioned this, that the original shared sacred stories are what we call are the world religions. They're really trying to talk about the fullness of reality. So we asked our teams to take on a retelling of their sacred story. So Anant was asked to retell a Hindu story faithfully, but creatively. Tradition is yesterday's creativity. It's our memory. Tradition-ing is the step forward. And to retell would be radically faithful to its origin and to the way it iterated itself over time, but now faces new challenges. And what was the mandate? Judith, Anant, Netanel, Rory, and all the others, retell your sacred stories to illustrate or to give the experience of how your taste of the sacred in your heritage grounds you in solidarity or interbeing with the rest of the human family and all of the rest of the community of being, for us, the earth and its web of life. This is a very authentic way to ask each of the traditions to retell to the rest of the world what the experience of the sacred does in terms of grounding them in a radical solidarity of unrestricted mercy, compassion, or love, and the earth that we share. So that was the assignment. They had a particular request to retell their stories in our time, in our period, with our challenges, our promises, faithfully but creatively. Well, great. That's a good start. And those stand as their own stories. Each one is a jewel. Each one asks the reader to open their heart to contain the experience of the mercy or the love or the compassion that they experience dramatically by reading the story. Can you find space within yourself for this extraordinary experience of the sacred? But as we know, that's just a beginning. So we felt that was a preliminary end in itself, but preliminary to telling a shared sacred story. Parallel, we brought scientists, really good scientists, really reflective scientists, reflective about what they're doing when they do science. That's my 15 minutes. So I'm going to round it out, and then I'll turn it over. I'm almost there. So two or 3 minutes, and we'll get into the real stuff here. And they had a mandate, radically faithful to science as science, the most sophisticated and earnest science, to examine what the praxis of science is, the engagement of the consciousness of the scientist, and to bring that into a correlation with the spiritual mode of inquiry. So could we find bridges, a resonance between the scientific mode of inquiry and what I'll call the spiritual mode of inquiry? Well, it won't shock you. These were people who were already seized, like we were, that resonance is profound. That those quests both set out for they want to plumb the depths all the way. Scientists aren't happy, say, oh, I think we know a little more, that's enough. There's a quest there. And so that group gave us another extraordinary prerequisite for trying to tell a shared sacred story. With those as prerequisites, I need to take 1 or 2 more minutes and I'm done. And I want to tell you about the secret sauce. And this is really what really allows this to happen. So have you ever held a baby that's pre-verbal and looked into the baby's eyes and cooed to the baby, and what did you get? You got a radiant smile of mutual recognition. Pre-verbal knowing that I'm known, knowing that I'm loved, or that I'm being held in compassion. We had to retrace that step. We couldn't use the Buddhist language for the shared sacred story, or the Hindu language for the shared sacred story, or indigenous language for the shared sacred story. We had to go back to that most primordial interbeing, or primordial transcendent mutuality for Anant, Darshan. Experiencing from your own openness of the sacred, the sacredness of the other. From the Buddhist, the awakened know the awakened. They don't need words to acknowledge it. They know the awakened. There's a mutual knowing. And so too with all the traditions, the Muslims. I made you tribes so that you might know one another. And so our real sauce was coming into a profound mutuality. everybody anchored in their own exquisite depth, unfathomably deep anchor of the sacred, and little smiles of recognition, like the little infants. I know what you mean. I would say it differently, but I see it in you, and the smile is returning back, and I see it in you. Then we were ready to try, with all the other preparatory work, all of their scholarship, just as servant, to begin to say, could we write a shared sacred story? If we could have a shared sacred worldview, and we'd be in a very different position as a human family. Thank you for your patience.
Okay, great. Can you hear me? All right. Thank you so much, Bill, and it's been such an honor and pleasure to work with you and with everyone. So I was one of the leaders of the Buddhism team in this project. Now we're at 4 years since we began this work together. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about the work of the Buddhism team. A little later, we'll talk about the shared sacred story that was put together by team members from different religious traditions, spiritual traditions. But I wanted first to share the Buddhism team story. We came together, 5 of us, from different Buddhist lineages. We had a Zen Roshi, a Pure Land priest, a Vipassana teacher who was also a Pali scholar, a Black American Buddhist, and myself as a Tibetan Buddhist. 3 of those people I knew from previous interreligious dialogue work. 1 person was new to me. And we met, we were a very conscientious team. We met every other week for 18 months. And the biggest challenge was, okay, we are being asked to retell a sacred story, but can we as a group agree on a story that's held in common with each of our lineages and traditions, coming from a very broad range of cultures and geographical locations? Should we tell the story of the Buddha? No, that was a little bit too much. So what should we do? So we spent some time, okay, what is the essential core that we share in common of what is the most important thing for each of us about Buddhist teaching? Where is the truth found? Where is the power found? Where is the profundity and the kindness and the wisdom found? And we came to the story that comes from the Pali tradition of Kisa Gotami. It's the story of a woman from a low caste who married above her station and had a hard time being accepted by her in-laws. And when she had a son, she was accepted by her in-laws. And so everything in her life depended on this little boy. So the story is about what happens when that little boy dies. I'm going to read you a section of our retold story. What we did is we took that core story, which is from the Pali Canon. It's one of the it's a small story, but it's become a very popular story in Western Buddhism. Many different teachers have taught this story. And as we worked on it together, we pulled out strains from the canon about this woman's life later when she became a Buddhist nun, and then she eventually became fully enlightened. And we developed a version of the story that reflected aspects of each of our lineages so that we could feel that all of our lineages were represented in the retelling of the story. It was no longer a story just from the Pali tradition. It came from Mahayana traditions. It had Zen elements. It had Pure Land elements. It had Vajrayana elements. And yet it worked together as a narrative, as a whole. And then after we created the story, which took quite a long time because in my team, unlike some of the other teams, we all were authors. We all wrote parts, and then we critiqued each other's parts, and it was quite a journey because we didn't all agree. So there was a real bonding that happened through some very difficult conversations about what is the real story of this person. After we finished the story, we sent it out to 13 Buddhists who were Buddhist leaders and practitioner scholars from all over the world. And we said to them, does this story tell your story of the Dharma? And please tell us what we may have missed. And they wrote critiques. And we took all their critiques and we made decisions about what to include, and we rewrote the story again based on those 13 people. All in all, we had 24 people working on our story. And just to give you a sense of the scope of this and the number of people who developed a kind of investment and caring about this particular sacred story. So it was a remarkable process of dialogue and getting closer and closer to each other about what was most essential about the Dharma for each of us, and how could we begin to resonate to each other's sense of what is most important, and how could we create a story that all of us could say, yes, this is our story. So this was a microcosm of the entire project, you could say. And even to this day, my team feels invested in every word in this book. They are definitely waiting to get their copies of the book so they can go over it and make sure it's still our story. So I wanted to read an excerpt from our story that is, it happens after Kisa Gotami, after her son died in floods, in early monsoon floods. She is in complete denial. And the story is told in her voice all the way through. And she thinks her son is ill and is not willing to say that he's dead. So she carries him around dead in her arms. He's about 3 years old. And finally it suggested she go to the Buddha. So I'm going to read a portion of this part of the story. As she approached the Buddha, she says, "My child is very ill. Please help him." I saw a softening in his eyes. "Thank you for coming. Let me take a look. What is your name?" "Kisa Gotami. I am from Madhyapura village," I added, choking back my tears. As he spoke, he gazed into my eyes, bringing me out of distraction. The clarity of his awareness and the expansiveness of his heart were holding me. I felt protected. He addressed me calmly. "Yes, I can help you, Kisa Gotami. This is a very serious situation, but I can offer some special medicine. Because the circumstances are so grave, the medicine must be potent, made from the purest of ingredients." He told me to go to every house in the nearby town of Shravasti and gather a yellow mustard seed from each home that had never known death. Then I was to return to him. I was so happy that the Buddha had promised to help me. He had promised to make a medicine. The town of Shravasti was large and prosperous. There were certain to be many who could give me a yellow mustard seed. Early the next morning, I set out with joy, urgency, and determination. Still carrying my poor little son, I hurried to the first hut in the village. A young mother met me at the door. I asked, "Have you ever known death?" Her eyes brimming with tears, she answered, "Yes. Last spring, my 5-year-old son died of a terrible chill that refused to loosen its grip. When our eyes met, I knew she understood the depth of my pain, but I hurried on." And then the story goes on with a number of other encounters in many other households. Everywhere I went, the litany was the same: death from fever and stomach ailments, from heart attacks, from accidents, as well as mysterious unattended deaths. The people in each household, whether rich or poor, had known death. I began to see my own face in each of theirs. It was a dawning realization. Perhaps what Raja and my family had told me was true. Perhaps my son was not merely sick. Perhaps he had already died. I looked more closely at his little body in my arms. Perhaps he was dead. His skin was pallid, turning blue. His body was stiff. Perhaps it was too late. Could he not be saved? But underneath all these questions was the realization that I was not alone. I had not been singled out for cruel suffering, nor isolated from others' lack of understanding. There was no evil spirit torturing me or bad luck that had happened to find me. Still, I continued my search, not knowing what else to do. And she still has a few more encounters. And then she goes, heartbroken, I set out to find the Buddha, still carrying the body of my son. Not a single home could offer me a mustard seed. Every home had known death. I was now ready to accept this truth, but something new had awakened in me. I returned to the Buddha early the next day, still carrying the body of Anupam. I placed him gently on the grass and bowed deeply before the Buddha, touching my head respectfully to his feet. There was not a single home that had not known death, I said. I could not stop my tears from falling. My son is gone. The Buddha smiled gently and spoke. The mustard seed is small, and its taste is exceedingly sharp. It is also common to every household. Now you have received the medicine that I promised. So this story has been told many, many times. In this fully developed version of the story, she goes on with her spiritual journey, becomes a nun, becomes an old woman, tremendously wise and revered in her village. And she tells her life story in segments to the villagers and gathers many, many followers who turn to her for her wisdom. It was such an incredible honor and pleasure to work together with my team on developing this story, and we are so excited to share the full story of her life with all of you. And so now we're going to move on to the Hindu story with Anant. Thank you, Anant.
Thank you very much, Judith, and dear sisters and brothers. Greetings to each one of you. It's a very special honor to be here this evening with you for, as Bill said, the first launch of our Sacred Stories book. One of the great gifts of this project for me has been my colleagues here, Rory, Judith, Netanel, and of course Bill, because this project also blessed me with the gift of friendship. And all of us started off perhaps as strangers, but after 4 years of work, we became very, very deep and close friends, and that's a very precious blessing for which I am deeply grateful to each of my friends here and to those who are not here. So I recall vividly, perhaps just over 4 years ago, when I received a telephone call from dear Bill, our visionary leader for this project, asking me if I would join this Sacred Story project. I had known Bill for a long time, but as he told me earlier on this evening, but we had not had the opportunity to build a very deep and close relationship. We had worked in different organizations. But I received this call very fresh from a series of meetings to which he had invited me at the Vatican. This was at the Academy for Sciences. And I got to know Bill much better through those meetings. So when he asked me if I would join this project, without giving much thought to what I was getting into, but out of friendship and love, I said yes, not knowing that it would really, as Judith said, it would really consume my life for the next four years. And so I was entrusted by their Bill to put together a Hindu team, and we struggled, as Judith explained so brilliantly, with what story to tell and how to tell that story. Because while all of our traditions are very diverse, I think Hinduism is the most diverse of all of the religious traditions. Because as you know, the word Hindu doesn't point to a founder, a founding figure. It doesn't point to a practice. It doesn't point to anything. It's a geographical term. It's simply the name of a river. And those who inhabited the territories drained by that river were called Hindus. So from the very inception, we were dealing with tremendous diversity. So we realized, it would be wrong to homogenize this tradition or to tell one story as if it is their Hindu story. So that was the first challenge that we faced. So I brought together a team. Of course, I led the team, but I was also one of the participants in the writing process. My own practice, my own scholarship is in the Vedanta tradition, and particularly non-dual Hindu teaching and practice, Advaita. And then I had a scholar and practitioner from the Vaishnava tradition. This is a tradition centered around the divine as Vishnu. And I had a female scholar and practitioner who came from the Shaivite tradition, the tradition centered around the divine as Shiva. I had another distinguished female scholar who is a practitioner and a writer coming from what we call the Shakta tradition. These are the traditions centered around the divine as feminine, as mother. And finally, a scholar and practitioner, two more, a scholar and practitioner of the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition, a more contemporary Hindu tradition, because I wanted to show that the tradition was also dynamic. It was innovative. It was creative. It was growing, and not simply a tradition of the past. And then I had another young scholar, recent PhD, who had great expertise in eco-theology, and so he also became a member of our team. So what we did very briefly was to try to weave certain important themes. Pilgrimage, or yatra, as we say in Sanskrit, is a very important practice in the Hindu tradition. The geography of India is sacred geography, and it's people travel to India, people travel in India to visit all of these sacred, powerful sacred sites or tirthas. So we wanted to highlight the significance of sacred space and geography as part of the common experience of Hindus. And secondly, we wanted to bring in, of course, in association with those sacred spaces, the rich, diverse theologies that have evolved. The non-dual theologies, the theologies of love, the theologies centered on the divine mother and Shiva and so on. So the theological diversity. And then, of course, to bring to the fore in the story the multiple faces of the divine. The divine as Shiva, the divine as Vishnu, the divine as Kali, the divine as mother. So to also lift up which I needed to do, It's a story of my life. Speak closely into the microphone. Many people have been working on me on this, believe me. So to bring forth the many faces of the divine, the many sacred tirthas, and of course the many sacred theologies. So our first initial plan was each of us, the 5 of us, would become pilgrims to India. We'll create characters based on ourselves, and we would journey to India. And at each sacred site, one of us would be the guide, both to the sacred space and to the theology that has evolved around that space. So we went to Rishikesh, we went to Brindavan, we went to Ganesh Puri, we went to Auroville, and then we went to Dakshineshwar in Kolkata, and each one led the group and became the leader. And we ended up with a pretty significant manuscript. But it was not working. Something was, we had a lot of material, but when we ourselves read it, or some of our colleagues read it, because all of our stories, most of our stories were workshopped intensively by our colleague in other teams. Something was missing in this story. It was somehow not holding together. It was not holding the attention of the reader. It was not gripping. It was not moving. And I struggled with this. And so, on a more personal note, I remember very vividly that it was a Sunday afternoon. My wife is here, so she will remember. I was sitting in one of the rooms of our home in Minnesota, agonizing, and I was telling her that something is missing. This is not working. We need something more in this story. What will hold this story together? What would make the reader want to go on this pilgrimage with us? And if there is truly an experience of a creative breakthrough that I've experienced as a scholar and a writer, it happened that afternoon. And a woman named Maitri entered into our hearts. And it was as though she said, I will help you. I will become the figure that will hold your story together. And I asked my wife to please bring a notepad and let us start writing. And we brought Maitreyi to life, and Maitreyi brought our story to life. And we rewrote the whole story. Every phase of it, built it around this woman, Maitreyi. She and her husband were professors here, migrants from India, professors here in the United States at a university in California, and always planned that when they retired, they would go on a pilgrimage to India, as many Hindus do in the later stages of their life, in search of spiritual meaning and truth. But her husband, Prem, died very suddenly, and Maitreyi had to decide whether she would go embark on this search on her own. And our story tells the story of Maitreyi's journey across India, dealing with the grief of Prem's loss, but on this quest for spiritual meaning and for truth. And I hope when you read our story, you would see why Maitreyi brought life to the Hindu story, and we named it Maitreyi's quest, and I am deeply grateful to my wife for the voice and the presence that she brought to this work. So I want to read a short piece from our story to you. And the section that I will read is at the very beginning of our story, Maitri's arrival as a widow in India. At 1 in the morning, the New Delhi train station bustled with people. A cacophony of sound and pungent smells filled the station. People talking, yelling, laughing, children crying, and the ringing and pinging of phones. The acrid smell of diesel mixed with the distinctive spicy aroma of street food. Shivering, Maitri pulled her white sari tightly around her sloped shoulders and adjusted her woolen shawl over her graying hair. Her fingers gently clutched the silver locket around her neck, which held a picture of her beloved husband, Prem, with whom she had planned this pilgrimage to sacred sites in India. Maitri and Prem had worked for more than 30 years as professors at a renowned university in California until his sudden death 6 months earlier. They had planned this pilgrimage as a journey to find a deeper meaning in life that had so far eluded them, despite professional and personal material success. They wanted to enter together the stage of Hindu life when, after fulfilling family obligations, one committed to spiritual study, reflection, and practice. Her son Krishna, or Chris as he liked to be called, and her daughter Asha had flown with her to New Delhi from Los Angeles earlier that week. They had joined Maitri in a sacred ceremony on the bank of the Yamuna River to immerse Prem's ashes. Much to the chagrin of Chris and Asha, Maitri was determined to embark alone on the rest of her journey. Maitri gingerly lifted her sari as she climbed a single step onto the train. The same porter who had taken her bag had returned, and he quickly led her to her cabin. Maitri's thoughts returned to earlier that morning when, with Chris and Asha, she had gone to the Yamuna River. The priest, awaiting their arrival, signaled them to draw closer. Holding the small clay pot wrapped in red cloth, containing Prem's ashes in her hands, Maitri led her children down the steps to the water's edge. The priest placed a handful of marigold flowers into the hands of Asha and Chris, while chanting an ancient mantra in honor of God as Shiva. We worship the omniscient Shiva, fragrant and nourishing, who liberates us from death, like a ripe fruit separating from its vine. Om, peace, peace, peace. As she remembered this, Maitri relived the heart-wrenching moment when, with trembling hands, she tipped the clay pot, and Prem's ashes gently fell and joined the flowing waters of the Yamuna. Asha and Chris offered flowers to the Yamuna as the sacred river carried their father's ashes to the ocean. Maitri silently prayed that as raindrops from the sky reach the sea, Prem's soul will find its way to unity with the divine. She held her children closely as they stood on the river steps, watching the flowers and their father's ashes around a bend in the river. And this begins Maitri's journey. Thank you.
So at this point, we're going to be moving to the interspiritual stories I'm not sure which one of you is going next.
We'll figure it
Yes,
out.
please, Netanel. Okay.
Well, several of our teams had co-leaders and sometimes 3 leaders. And luckily, Rory was able to be here tonight, so we were the co-leaders of the Interspiritual team. And I think we were probably the last team to come on. Is that correct? And that was a bit of bravery on the part of Bill and a program officer, Megan Campbell, to recognize that how are the people that are not finding themselves in traditions or between traditions to be represented? Is there something emergent? And to give some space to that. And so Rory and I were brought on, and maybe we'll divide this a little bit. Rory, maybe you can talk a little bit about how our team came together and what our early process was. And then I'll pick up wherever you want.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you to everyone who organized this first. I always want to say that, and to Naropa, and to Bill and Fetzer. And as Anant was saying, a big thank you to Anant and Judith, and especially all the other members of the teams. Anant kind of referenced this, but it was really, I think that it was wonderful writing the stories, but the process was really deepening. So Fetzer would have us out and all the team leaders from the different traditions, and we literally read each other's stories, critiqued them, workshopped them, came back again and did the same thing. And so there was kind of this constant back and forth, which at times with the interspiritual, I don't even think you can say tradition, because that's not really what it is. Everyone was really lovely to us. Sometimes it feels like you're traipsing on other people's territory, right? And they feel like that too. And so it takes a lot of generosity and a lot of time to see for yourself what is happening and to be able to discern it with actual people who are trying to live out these values of a spiritual journey and love and compassion and wisdom in the world. And so maybe it makes sense before I'll say a little bit about how our interspiritual team started in the story, but to just say a couple things about interspiritual first probably makes sense, or at least how we are interpreting it. So there's many different ways. So we couldn't pick a story from a tradition, but interspiritual for us meant, I think, and Netanel might want to add to this or correct me, but 2 main things is it brings a focus really to the spiritual journey and to contemplative life, wherever that might be found. So a depth of transformation of the human condition into inconceivable expressions of love and compassion and wisdom that connect with the deepest part of who we are and ultimately are who we are, beyond even the stories that we tell ourselves about our lives. And so that kind of brings a focus for traditions to come together, because they have the wisdom and the lineages, I think, I just speak for myself here, at their best to help propel this potential of the human being together. So that's one aspect of interspiritual, and the other is the kind of atmosphere or milieu that's created when that focus is present, and diversity. The diversity of expressions, of paths, which are many. And so I would kind of phrase it maybe as increasing intimacy among our religious traditions, especially the spiritual and contemplative traditions, and an intimacy of sharing our deepest experiences of reality and awakening and union with God and more with one another. And in that practice, in that exchange, we're affected. Maybe change is too big of a word, but it's not nothing that's happening. And it's not just a respect of, I see you over there and I respect what you're doing. Because when we're talking about the depths of the spiritual, it's energetic. There's spiritual energy, there's lineages behind them, there's potency, and these are becoming more intimate with one another as well. And I think, one of my very close teachers was Father Thomas Keating, a Catholic monk who started something called the Snowmass Conferences and dialogues, where he'd bring together teachers or advanced practitioners from different traditions for dialogue for like a week every year for 40 years, usually at his monastery. And I think, that was one experiment, but the intimacy among them was also an intimacy among the lineages and energies and spiritual traditions that they were carrying. And something began to happen as these lineages became more intimate with one another and allowed, say, someone like me to come forth and very naturally have teachers from different traditions in a way that was focused and respectful, and all in service of my own spiritual becoming and deepening and weakening of an egoic self-center. Maybe they didn't even expect that, but sometimes intimacy leads to unexpected consequences. And then we have to deal with them. There's some responsibility there. And so I think these are kind of the two aspects of the interspiritual that we really wanted to hold up in our story. And it began, so our kind of core team was Netanel and I and Brenda Salgado, an indigenous teacher who I believe gave, I know because I was here, the commencement address a number of years ago at Naropa. Alejandra Warden, who's from Argentina and had spent many years in Christian contemplative practice and then a couple decades mentored very, I don't know what the right word is, intensely in a Sufi tradition. And then ultimately, some of her most profound teachings are on the divine feminine and the spiritual path, uniquely from the perspective of a woman, some of, if you want to say, differences that come with that, but just how life as a woman in the world, and then some of the ways that might orient us towards a spiritual journey. And this came through a very powerful series of visions that she had throughout her life. Wonderful teacher. And then Father Matthew Wright, who's an Episcopal priest and a close friend. So that was our core team, and it began by all of us getting together up in Steamboat Springs, Colorado, at my dad's house for 4 or 5 days. And we stayed in the same house, and we hung out together and had meals. And ultimately, there was a spark that came out of that meeting that we felt really held a kind of power to it. I certainly did. And so I felt like we were shepherding this spark or this idea that carried a certain potency with it into the story. And it was about the gauchos, if I'm saying that right, in Argentina. I think maybe Alejandra or Brenda, I'm sure, are the first to think of it, but how people used to just go and begin to gather throughout the year or at a certain time each year to gather around a fire and tell stories to one another. And that this was a way of bonding and community and also sharing the depths of each other's experience with one another in a way that affects us, changes us, and builds a kind of a solidarity, I guess you could say, in a communion that can't necessarily be put into words, but is very real and very powerful. And so we built, it's also the primal way of human beings meeting each other, right? This is what all our ancestors did all the time. For all we know, it's what birthed human consciousness. And so our story takes place 100 years from now, with a kind of reference that we narrowly avoided disaster of the human race, not without dire consequences, but and as a way of avoiding such dire consequences in the future, people began to gather around the world in little circles once a year on what we call the Day of Remembrance around a fire to tell stories. Stories about their own spiritual journeys, their own journeys of transformation, not only their own personal stories, also other stories that had happened in our human history and that illustrated to some degree a coming together of difference, a coming together of different traditions, different teachers from traditions, and just regular human beings, really trying to live life and find a depth of meaning. There's stories of resistance to oppression in there, stories of some form of reconciliation after horrific oppression. There's a lot of stories. I don't know how, 13 or something, I can't even remember. And so that it became the interspiritual story. Also because there's no way to illustrate interspirituality with a single story. So it doesn't name what it is. It creates more an ambiance, an atmosphere in which the interspiritual can be felt. And one thing I always like to say, I love it, in our story, all of our stories are true. So they're not fictional. They're either historical accounts that you can find, or they were personal stories of people in our group or of someone we knew, of something that actually happened to them in their life. And so that's probably enough for me. Yeah, I'm excited to see what Netanel has to say.
I think that's one of the things that we were most proud of, having completed our story that has an overarching story that holds multiple smaller stories. And one of the things we were most proud of is there was nothing that wasn't true in them. We weren't painting a fanciful picture of a world we wanted to see, and we're trying to convince people that these wonderful interactions between religions can happen. They did happen. And we were telling the true stories of how they happened. And as Rory said, we were trying to be humble in telling these stories because interspirituality as a movement doesn't have one definition. There are people that are using that as a convenient term to cover a number of categories for what is emerging. And we didn't think it was for us to define interspirituality for people, but to give examples of interspirituality. And so we did that through these stories. And those came together fairly well, meaning coming up with the examples was fairly easy, and we were each contributing. But many of us, many of our teams benefited from, one, workshopping the stories together, and that really was a wonderful process. Gathering and reading our stories and getting the feedback, and it really did bond us, and our stories benefited. But we also had access to a professional editor, and one of the benefits of our editor, one of the things that she really added, because we had gathered a number of these true stories, and we had a matrix for them, which was 100 years from now, we made it. We never say what we made it through, but we know we made it. Maybe we know now. And so we did have the idea of gathering on the Day of Remembrance, where we would gather in small circles around the planet and tell the stories of our connectedness. But what our editor, Maria Much, a lovely person, suggested was that we needed a witness for our stories. We needed a character that would witness these stories in this moment. And so I think we went into retreat, actually. It was at our retreat facility in New Mexico. And with that little bit of information, I sat down in my retreat cabin and closed my eyes and thought of who the witness would be. And began, I watched emerge a character with her own voice and her own perspective. And so that's how our story begins, with this character. And so I'll read just the framing for our story. But I need different glasses. And before I left, I printed out the page and printed out the wrong page, so I'm going to use Judith's copy of the book here. The Bearers of Remembrance. The first time I came to the fire, I was not yet 23 and not really sure I wanted to be there. I'd come at the invitation of my grandmother, who had been the firekeeper for many years. When I was a child, I saw her often, and we had a special relationship, the kind that bristled with a sense of magic. I felt as if there was a secret between us that no one else shared. But when I was 12, my parents moved us out of state, and I saw her less and less. We visited occasionally, and she sometimes visited us. But by then, I was a teenager, beginning my own stumbling exploration of life, and somehow forgetful of all the magic that had once existed between us. So by the time I came to visit her just after my college graduation, I was disturbed to find that our relationship now felt stilted and awkward. The special secret we had once shared now seemed like an empty box I had treasured and kept for years without knowing why. Had she always been this person, or was it me who had changed? I stayed with her for a week, unsure of how to relate to this eccentric old woman who felt like a stranger. Whenever possible, I made excuses about work to be done for my classes and hid in my room talking to friends. But on the last night of my stay, on the day of remembrance, my grandmother insisted I come with her, saying that it was time I came to the fire. Of course, I had heard about the Day of Remembrance my whole life, which is not to say that I knew what it was exactly. It was just something that was mentioned often enough in my family to be familiar. What was it really about, or what was actually done on that day, I had no idea. We drove an hour or so north from San Francisco into the high country along the coast, finally parking in the late afternoon near a collection of cars outside an old outpost. Together, we began to walk up an uneven dirt path to the escarpment overlooking the Gulf of the Farallones. The place of the fire was less ritually exalted than I had imagined. It was an ordinary fire pit with a well-stacked pile of wood and kindling on it, the ground around it set with chairs. The whole thing seemed a bit silly to me. I felt like the adult, my grandmother a child, I had to indulge. I was surprised, however, to see people of all ages there. I had supposed it would be a gathering of my grandmother's friends, all of similar age and in need of similar indulgence. But these people were different from what I had expected. I found them interesting for reasons I could not quite express. The respect they showed my grandmother surprised me and unexpectedly moved me, even as I struggled to understand all that I was seeing. When the ceremony began, my grandmother motioned for me to take a seat where I could observe from outside the inner ring of chairs, as I was not a member of the circle. I sat down on an old redwood stump, feeling it touch my sit bones through my jeans. As the sky darkened, she was handed a special torch, and it was then that I saw my familiar grandmother transformed, assuming the face of a dignified elder rising to light the fire of remembrance. I learned later that she was the eldest of the circle and with the longest memory of past fires. The night was cold and growing darker now, and I welcomed the fire's warmth, a feeling that perhaps made me a little more vulnerable to its primal charms, its light dancing on my grandmother's lined face, transforming her into the priestess of an ancient rite, the fire keeper, ready to tell the story of the bearers of remembrance. Thank you.
We have one more story to talk about, and then we're going to be opening it to all of you. Bill talked about this in the opening, that the project had these dimensions of a variety of spiritual traditions retelling their stories. But that was not the culminating aspect of the entire project, because as Bill talked about the recognition that comes when you look in the face of a baby, there was a sense that over time we developed much more sense of what Rory was talking about as intimacy between our teams and our traditions. And we set out to identify and to create a new story that was inclusive of all the different stories told, the 9 other stories, to find some way to capture the power and the intimacy of those stories in a brand new story that was called the Shared Sacred Story. So a team was created of about 5 of us. Bill and I were the leaders of the team, and then Anant was part of that. It's one of the reasons why Anant and I feel so connected, because after our working with our individual teams, we also worked with this core team. So we had a Hindu, a Buddhist, a Confucian, and 2 Christians in the core team. And the challenge we took on is, how could we tell a very contemporary story that captures the peril of our time? The social, economic, environmental, political chaos and challenges of our time. How could we tell a story that was not connected to just one spiritual tradition, but to our common humanity? And how could we capture some kind of energy of that dilemma that we're all facing? And so we spent time together sort of floundering around. We had ideas of rather utopian ways of telling a story. We had ways of sort of drawing in strands and weaving strands from many different spiritual and cultural traditions. And then we arrived at the idea that the story that we would tell would be set in a refugee camp. At some point in the future, a refugee camp with all of the rubble, the lack of resources, the hopelessness, people from many different displaced communities all thrown together in a refugee camp guarded by some unnamed military, and that this would be the setting. It's like what in Tibetan Buddhism we speak of as a kind of charnel ground. It's a kind of charnel ground environment. And the focus of the story is the protagonist is a woman, probably midlife woman, who has been scientifically trained, who has had a little bit of medical training, and she is recruited to be the doctor of the camp. She has lost her homeland that is a beautiful island that is is lost. It's not clear how it was lost, whether environmental or political or other reasons. She has lost her family, she's lost her husband, she's lost her daughter, and she's left with a young son, a very young son. And she feels incredible grief and hopelessness, tremendous cynicism about spirituality, a tremendous sense of just devastation about her circumstances. And the story is about her taking care of a number of patients, but one particular patient who's an elderly man who is dying. He's in advanced stages of cancer, and he's dying. This elderly man is a spiritual seeker who finds tremendous joy in the world and in the camp, and carries a kind of inner peace that she cannot understand and she thinks is just plain stupid. And so this is the central theme of the story. Does that capture it? Does that capture it? So we had one particularly gifted fiction writer as a member of our team who was the lead writer, and then all of us worked with him to make it as accessible and down to earth as possible. And our purpose was really to capture in perhaps the extreme what many of us are feeling: hopelessness, fear, worry, and a sense that spirituality is gone and is really, there are little pockets of it, but it's not doing anyone any good. And so it's the relationship with the old man that is the core pivot point of the story. So we did workshop this story with other team members, and there were lots and lots of suggestions. We were unable to incorporate them all. A portion of the story includes the notebooks of the old man with his vision about spirituality in a world of tremendous challenge, a very inclusive, a very loving spirituality that creates an inner resource for people in difficult times. So the story has two parts: a more fictional part and then a visionary part from the old man's notebooks. So we have selected, Anant and I worked hard on this story, and we independently picked the same 4 paragraphs that we wanted to have read.
It was truly. I wrote to Judith last night. I said, Judith, have you decided what we will read? And I said, this is what I think you should read. We should read. And she said exactly what I thought and what I chose. So it was a really wonderful moment of coming. And this is about 50 pages long, but we came to the same paragraphs independently. So the 2 paragraphs I will read. And these are really very powerful stories. You know, we have a word in the Hindu tradition. We speak of the sacred text as sruti, which means that which is to be heard. You know, the power comes from hearing even more than scripture is reading, but sruti is what you hear, and you're moved in a way by the oral sound. And I think all of the stories, but I hope you will see also the shared story has a certain power when it is heard. So the paragraphs I chose describe the moment of the old man's passing. And as Judith said, the story is really the story of the relationship between this old man dying and the pharmacologist who is caring for him, and the way in which she's transformed. And she comes back to life. She rediscovers her own heart through this relationship. There are no words for the experience of his death. I am not even sure how it was that those of us who spent time with him in his last hours, myself, the 2 nurses, the young pharmacist, the janitor, those 2 guards and stretcher bearers, all shared in it together, but we manifestly did. There were no miracles, no supernatural signs, no hints of unseen presences. There was only the light and the lightness, for want of a better word, that seemed to break through his pain and his weakness, a radiance, even a joy at times on his face, and a peacefulness that he emanated. We all had a sense of it and talked about it afterward, and concluded together that in his fading moments, he was reconciled with everything, and that what we saw in us, in the world, even maybe in his death, was something real to him, even if it was invisible to us. Certainly, the love he felt for us, for everyone, for everything, was suddenly palpable in the room, as if it were pouring out towards us in waves. Even before his heart and breathing had stopped, I thought how odd it was that I felt so dead in the midst of life, while he seemed to overflow with life in the midst of his own dying. I think that was when I began to waken from my emotional numbness, a little reluctantly perhaps. Despair, after all, can be a safe and restful condition. In the days that followed, as I continued to awaken more fully, the effects of the experience began to show themselves. About 4 days after his death, something broke through all my defenses.
And I'll continue from there. I just wanted to say this is composed as a letter to her son some years later, describing this experience. It was in the afternoon, not long before twilight. You were inside the clinic taking a nap under the watchful eyes of the practical nurse. I had stepped outside as a break from the day's routine in the infirmary. There were children playing not far away. I found myself staring at them in fascination and realized that what I found entrancing about them was not their horribly ephemeral happiness and innocence, as had been the case before, but instead their beauty. One child in particular caught my attention, a little girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, surrounded by barren earth and weathered canvas tents and heaps of debris and rubbish, dressed in rags. But with her arms outspread, a look of delight on her face, dancing, turning around and around. To me, it was a heartbreaking sight, of course, but also not heartbreaking at all. Just then, I was seeing precisely what he had told me I should see. Her dance was glorious. The ecstasy of innocence, the happiness of a child who can exult amid despair and desolation, because her joy came with her into the world and demanded of her that she dance as if she were in the midst of paradise. And all at once I knew that I loved her. I even realized I love her with the love I felt for you. Not, I mean, with the love equivalent to what I felt for you, but instead, just as the infuriating old man had told me, with the love that you drew out of me, now somehow mysteriously continuing to extend beyond the two of us, to enfold that little girl into its embrace. And for just a moment, I had an overwhelming sense of the real possibility of the real experience of being seized by love for everyone and everything, of loving everything by loving in particular. And before we open it up to everyone here, Bill, is there anything you'd like to share about the shared sacred story process that we as a team went through?
Thank you very much. Very brief. We were thinking, when we thought of the characters, we were thinking of us, the human family. And so she's a scientist. She's the person who has sort of embraced that world, and so she represents, to a certain extent, I don't want to be simplistic about this, she's herself, but we were thinking about our human family, and she was a representative of our modern experience and finding its way back home.
So we'd like to open it to you now. Anything you'd like to ask or comment on, whatever, and of any of us. Yes, if you could come to the microphone so that people online can hear you and see you. And please don't be shy. We'd love to hear from you. Leah, yes. By the way, Leah is selling this book in this corner of the room. Thank you, Leah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Leah. I have a bit of a tough one. It seems like a lot of these stories happen in the wake of some kind of tragedy, whether having made it through the tragedy or like still in the ripple of it. And I'm curious if our like traditions or narrative, whether spiritual or not, rely on tragedy or difficulty to stay relevant or meaningful to us. And like, is there a place of potential for strength and meaning making to be able to stand as sovereign without tragedy?
It's a wonderful question. And if we examine our lives, we dodge it as long as we can, and then we can't. And so the issue there, it's a wonderful question. I think we as a collective recognized that if the spiritual can't hold up when it is the only thing one has, it's not. Is it a palliative, or does it go all the way down, even where we have nothing left, and where we are so vulnerable that there is nothing except the grounding that would hold us even there, or even in death? So I think there was a decision in an age where not only is spirituality abandoned by many, but it's also degraded. It's also, I don't mean to be mean here, but there's a kind of spa spirituality, right? And we weren't after that, frankly. It had to hold up for all of us. And so we composed a context in which we had to deal with that. And it's all the more radiant in our experience. So it's not seeking hardship for hardship's sake by any means, but thank you.
I think I can say it wasn't contrived. Our stories were developed independently. And so these small groups got together and thought, what is the context for telling a story? And we discovered when we came together that stories were told around the death of a significant loved one, difficult circumstances. So I think Bill is right, but it wasn't as if that was a common agreement, and then we went back and took that. That's what kept coming up, that it has to help us through the tough times. And if it doesn't, it's probably not worth doing. So just to say, yeah, it wasn't contrived.
Hi, everyone. So we have a question from online that I'll read. This is from Marie Ann. And it's actually a question that Amelia also had, so it's perfect. My question, each story featured a main character that seemed to represent the divine feminine. Was that discussed among the groups? And what can you comment further about that?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question. In our group, we were the first group to finish a story. So in our group, we spent time contemplating, and it felt natural to choose a story about a woman and her journey. There was something so universal and personal, and it gave a kind of grounded quality to the story, particularly because it's such a compelling story anyway. What we began to find is, as each of the teams began to bring their stories forward, everybody was writing with women protagonists and women narrators, and it was not discussed. It was something that happened in team after team. The other thing that I noticed is the teams that had all men seemed to not be able to get to the story. They were more philosophic. Pardon me for saying so. They were more theoretical and more theological. And when women were added to the team, there was more story and more earthiness about the whole thing. So as the teams, as certain teams began to run aground and have sort of incredibly theological qualities, the women came in as characters or as authors, and the stories became so much more human and relatable and more actual stories. So the divine feminine was at work in the whole project, and we'd never discussed it. We have noticed that there are a lot of women in this book, but definitely I believe the divine feminine infused as the need to stay away from theology and doctrine and to get into life and story. The divine feminine was taking us there. I do think that's true. Thank you for asking the question.
I'd like to add a little bit to that. I told you that our protagonist was a woman, but I didn't tell anyone else. Rory knew that. And I knew it as the author because I could see my character. But what was interesting is when we gave the story to the other team members, and when they would speak about the character, I remember Judith kept referring to he, and others would say she. There is no actual reference to their gender, and that was intentional. We wanted this character to represent, like many of my students, some gender fluidity. I knew what its biological identity was. And so I said that here, but she was intentionally written, vague, just to represent where we are now.
I spoke, about the appearance of Maitri, of course, a woman in our Hindu story, Maitri's quest. And while, we didn't intentionally set about to make the central character a woman, but having Maitri as the traveler in our story enabled us to address patriarchy and patriarchal structures in the Hindu tradition. So you would find that in the story she's also struggling as she journeys. So for example, I give you one example. When Maitri goes to Vrindavan, she goes, as I said, she's a widow. And she begins to notice that there were so many widows in Vrindavan, dressed in white, women like her. So she asks, why are there so many widows in Vrindavan? And then she discovers that when women lose their husbands at early ages, they often have nowhere to go. They're often abandoned in joint families by the families of their husbands. And many of them go to the city of Vrindavan. And so there's a discussion there that she has with a widow that lifts up the problem of patriarchy. So she enabled us to address, many social justice issues as she travels. Really, patriarchy is only one, but we come to issues of caste and gender and other such structural forms of injustice in our story.
What else do you have on your mind? Question or comment?
Thank you so much for all of the work that all of you have done on this. And I'm slightly worried about asking this question of you, but do you plan on a volume 2? The reason I ask that is, are there any traditions that you would like to engage with that you weren't able to, and what would those be? So, thank you.
So first of all, thank you for the question. So this is not a one and done. And we, as we shared at the very beginning, we were utterly sincere about not only each of the retellings, but also the shared sacred story. And we recognized that this attempt is an invitation for further such, it's an invitation for further such efforts. And one little point I think is a little bit side to your question, but worth sharing, particularly with the shared sacred story. We have an explicit invitation for every person to read it, if they have a tradition, through the eyes of their own tradition, or through the eyes of their own spiritual experience. There is no identification of the religion of the old man. There's no identification of the religion of the woman or the son or anybody else in the camp. And there's no geographical specificity. And so we believe that this was never an attempt on our part to substitute a shared sacred story for the Hindu story or the Buddhist story. We leave it to everybody's heart as the reader, how they would do that. But closer to your question, we ended up having about 150 people involved in this project. And so the practicality of adding 3 or 4 more traditions was what really was the issue at hand. But there's absolutely the interest to make this an invitation, and on Fetzer's part, even to more concretely extend that invitation. So we'll be looking forward to doing that. And we're also thinking, I mean, those on this panel, would there be children's versions of these stories that could be told? And would there be other forms? Would there, yeah, so we're thinking imaginatively how this might be accessible for people. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Yes. We'll take a few more questions, and then we're going to stop a few minutes early because we're doing a book signing for those of you who buy the book. Yes, what is your name?
Alex.
Alex. Wonderful.
So all of these stories explored the healing aspects of finding community and sort of the exploration of its impact in exploring pain and how people heal together. How important do you find this in your explorations of the sacred?
Personally?
Personally, and just throughout the religious spectrum.
I can say for myself and my team that we talked about this a lot. and found that even in our working together, we found a little community in our group of 5 of finding some kind of Rory's word, intimacy, across our different lineages, our different histories in our own practice and our own communities. And that sense that when we find ourselves in community, it's so much more than the sum of its parts. There's some kind of powerful discovery as a group. And resonating also to both what Anand and Netanel said, there's a sense in which Kisa Gautami as a human being came alive for us and began to feel like our spiritual teacher for all of us. We all began to have dreams about her and a sense of resonance. So there was a feeling that she became the wise figure who is the teacher for all of us in the diversity of our practice lineages. And that quality of, I would call it a kind of ecumenical Buddhist little mini Sangha that we had, was very, very powerful. I appreciate so much you're asking about community, because for all of our traditions, the sense of community is so much part of cultivating a deep sense of the sacred, so that it's not just an isolated human experience. So thank you so much.
I would just add to your excellent question that in our story, throughout the story, Maitreyi is carrying the grief of losing her husband suddenly. And this grief is erupting in unexpected ways, at unexpected times as she's journeying, even in her dreams. She sometimes forgets that he's passed, and she has a vivid dream of him when she awakens with deep sorrow and suffering. So the story is also the story of Maitreyi's spiritual search in the midst of really the pain of a very deep and a deep loss. But this story is also the story of her healing. Not completely, but every sacred place she goes to and every teacher she meets, she's also interrogating the teacher in relation to dealing with the pain of loss. At the end of the story, the pain of loss is still there, but she has come now to a more peaceful place of dealing with death and grief and loss.
There's a question here. Oh, a couple more questions.
So I have another question from online, but first a quick comment. Yesterday we had lunch with Professor Rambachan, and he told us about the project, and someone asked a question, these stories are so compelling, I can imagine a film. And at the same moment, Leah and I had an inspiration, which was anime. So I just want to share that, and maybe you can comment on that. But I have a question online, which is from Jamie. Through interspirituality, it was said that you will experience a certain impact through practice and exchange. And it was said that there is something energetic about this. I think, Rory, you were speaking about this. And so the question is, I want to know what exchange is being made.
That's a great question, and what a fun one to answer. Yeah, I think, one of the things Netanel and I have talked about, certainly for us, we see dialogue, and not any kind of dialogue, but really contemplative dialogue that's held in a contemplative space with spiritual depth as a spiritual practice. So that the dialogue itself becomes a practice. And I think anytime, so my first teacher was Brother Wayne Teasdale, who coined the word interspiritual. He was a Catholic monk who wore the orange robe of a Hindu sannyasin. He was initiated by Bede Griffiths, maybe his closest student, who experimented with Christian sannyasis, lived in India, lived an Indian lifestyle, remained a Catholic monk, but used liturgy and sacred scriptures from all different traditions. And Brother Wayne had Father Thomas Keating as his teacher, also the Dalai Lama, and he described Interspiritual as the sharing of our deepest experiences of reality with one another. And so what is being exchanged is the depths of who we are. And I think this happens in many ways, not just in spiritual sharing. I mean, when we see people in tragedy, when we go to movies, we hear stories, we read them, and especially when we're person to person and face to face with someone that touches depths of us that we don't normally reveal or see. We're affected by that. At least if we're open to it and we have a sensitivity to it. It's the same thing here. And in these depths of ourselves are mysteries. Because it's not just us that's there, we're all there. And our traditions are there, our lineages are there. The interconnection is not a theory, it's a reality. And so we're pulling cords in these depths of ourselves, and then it resonates in others from that same depth. So it's like depth calls to depth. And when that vibration happens, we feel it. And it helps us recognize these parts within ourselves that are connected. And somehow within that is the mystery of a unity in diversity, or the reality of a unity in diversity. And so we're helping each other to go deeper into that. Or at least that's my experience of it.
And this will be our last question. And
my question is more about the inception of the thought of what you tried to design. It seemed to be along the lines of promoting peace, conversation across cultures, countries, and religions, right? My question would be, is something like that that'd be so powerful of a cause to create that, do you also expect a resistance from multiple organizations or people, or that would want to combat your cause?
It's a terrific question, and it in response to the concern and even likelihood that at least in some quarters that could be deemed a dishonorable enterprise, not honoring the integrity. So we literally bent over backwards to ensure that the Buddhist story, Judith gave an example, but it was true for all of them. The authors had critics within the Buddhist community and leadership within the Buddhist community, so that story is a Buddhist story. So we made every effort to do that in each case. And we were very careful that I described earlier, that the shared sacred story, you're invited, and people are at all sort of different levels. Nobody knows what those religions were of those characters, and you're invited to read it according to either your tradition or your own very personal spiritual experience. So I think the danger of our project would be that we would take a shortcut, and we would be excited as people among ourselves and have a growing intimacy among ourselves, but we're not anchored, and we had a basic mandate to represent lineages and heritages. And I think that's what I think we have been able to do. Now, will everybody in every lineage or heritage find this congenial? good luck. I mean, I don't expect it. But I'm speaking as a person who, for 30 years of his life, have worked with the religious communities as communities in very difficult circumstances, in which often gathering around hard problems. And I want to use a funny term. It's a term that is in personal psychology, and people who are partners know the reality of this. It's mutual self-mediation. I do something kind to you, and you return kindness. My kindness draws your kindness out as an invitation. And so we get into a virtuous cycle. You're transforming me, and my responding back to you is helping to invite you to transform yourself. That's happening among our traditions as well. We're meeting everywhere, in villages. It's not just scholars. It's happening on the ground all over the world, in which people are gathering together, and because the problems cut across our communities. And so the challenges are ours. That's why the shared sacred story is set the way it is set. It's all of us. We're all here. And so some are going to be more interspiritual in their way of reading it. Others will read it as a Hindu and say, I can relate to this. So that was part of our concern, and therefore it informed the particular way we went about trying to do our job. But it's a beautiful question, and your concern will speak for certain people, I'm sure, who will find it a bridge too far at this moment. But this is not the end of history, as far as we can tell. So.
Thank you so much for being here. We've been so excited about this book coming out. It's being released soon. These are pre-publication releases, especially for us. And this is a great moment of joy and celebration for us to be able to share this with you. So I want to thank Fetzer Institute for the vision and the support to get us together to do something that's incredibly encouraging and uplifting in a time where there's not a lot of that around in our world. And the quality of being able to do this kind of work during these really grim times has been incredibly personally enriching, and I know that's been true for all of us. So thanks for joining us in this endeavor. We are going to stay right here. If you have books you'd like us to sign, we're going to pass them down and sign them for you. If you want to wait to buy the book at another time, it's on Amazon, but it's not released yet. It'll be out very soon.
Yeah, I think
Imminently. And I want to thank Mohammed and Terry and Bill for coming this distance to be with us tonight, and also to thank Anant for coming from Minnesota, and Rory from New Mexico, and of course we're here. Thanks so much.